23.1 Language, Space, and Self. When we talk about code switching, we mean shifting between languages or dialects in a broad sense. Code meshing would be merging multiple languages instead of switching. When we talk about moves, we mean using conventions specific to a genre or audience. Making moves establishes your fluency with the language and your status within the connected culture. When you make a move in your writing to communicate with an audience using a code that gives the text specific meaning, you are letting the audience members know that you speak their language and understand their culture. And when you shift your language use to communicate different meanings because you're in a different space or with a different group, you're practicing what we consider code switching. And if you find spaces where your identities overlap with another person's overlapping identities and you are both bilingual, you can mesh codes and merge meanings to communicate better. Speaking multiple languages can be literal and/or cultural. Two people might both speak English, but the dialects and connotations may represent different contexts and cultures that impact understanding. Or they could speak different languages but understand similar codes and moves. Language and how we use it is the ground of culture, and the two intersect and dissect around meaning and comprehension within communication. As a result, identity and language are intimately intertwined. Moves, and your ability to make them and spot them, define you as a member of a group and establish your linguistic identity. They situate you within the group. Switching codes is, in a way, switching linguistic identities. And meshing codes creates a new identity that merges these identities. As a result, your linguistic identity is a merger of these languages and cultures you inhabit and that inhabit you. The spaces where you speak and write often determine the codes and moves that cause you to shift. The terms codes and moves are based on complicated rhetorical and linguistic concepts. Our goal is to understand and use them in a broad sense to evaluate the samples of your writing communications and look for the places where you made choices that reflect and represent who you are in different places. Context and identity. Because the languages we use represent different worlds we inhabit and different parts of ourselves and our linguistic identities, these languages construct the way we see and understand our world. An easy and concrete example is vocabulary. If you have no word for something, you may struggle to discuss it, and that's only if you manage to think of concepts or recognize things for which you have no word, which probably doesn't happen often. But if you have a meaning-infused word to describe a concept, that is what you see. For example, your culture has taught you that the word tea has meaning, both a denotation, the dictionary definition, and a connotation, contextual coding. When you go to a restaurant and order tea, what do they give you? In Florida, they usually give you iced sweet tea. But up north, they'll give you iced unsweet tea. Hop over the pond to England and they'll give you hot tea with cream and sugar. If you ask for tea in India, you may get chai tea, and it may even be different depending on where you are when you ask. But what if you just said the word tea? Older people may picture the beverage, but the younger generation may picture different memes or cultural references where tea has a specific meaning. The Kermit the Frog meaning, I believe, is what we're referring to here. If you only know one use of the term, that is the use you will see and hear and use. If you don't understand the contextual connotation, you can't fully understand the communication. The meaning changes depending on who is using the word and where and why. If you know multiple meanings, you can use the context of the conversation to understand which meaning is intended. Similarly, some terms that share a denotation have very different connotations. Childish and childlike have the same dictionary definition, but do they mean the same thing to you? Well, why not? You may know a vocabulary term but not be fluent in the connotations and codes that gives terms meaning. Context plays a role but is not the same as coding. Codes provide the framework for making meaning from language, and context situates the language within a time and place so that audience and interaction can become part of the framework for meaning. Take, for instance, the term compromised. Consider the term within the phrase, compromise was the result. If that sentence were explaining the two sides came to an agreement, compromise would have a specific meaning. Without more context, the use of compromise seems neutral. But if one side thought the compromise was fair and useful and the other side thought it gave up too much, the same meaning of compromise would have different meanings when placed in context. If, instead, the question were referencing security or the immune system, the meaning would be very different. Use as a verb or noun in a sentence can indicate meaning, but without larger context, language can be unclear or misleading, intentionally or unintentionally. Different languages in different situations rely on context for comprehension more than other situations, and the farther removed the reader is from the context, culture, and coding, the more complicated it becomes to make sense of the intended meaning, let alone create a new understanding within the current context of the communication. An entire episode of All in the Family is built around a riddle intended to demonstrate that in the 1970s, women were not expected or accepted in specific roles. The gendered expectations were so culturally ingrained that when open to new ideas, one character admits that it never entered my head to consider the other perspective and reflects on his culture, saying, "Look at the way I've been trained to think." The idea the character recognizes as unthinkable, that a woman, a mother even, could be a surgeon, is clearly less shocking today. In fact, a majority of current medical students identify as female. Changes in biases do not spread through a whole culture at once, and shifts in laws and other prohibitions that reinforce the prejudices of the contexts in which they were designed and which they were often designed to maintain can take decades or generations to become the new normal. Language can lead or follow, but it has to change and adapt too. The riddle specifically referencing the unimaginable idea that women could be surgeons is so dated now that the question seen as impossible to answer then is easy for most people today. Although the idea of a woman who is a mother and a surgeon is an easily acceptable concept that may have become culturally accepted in theory, it is not yet widespread in practice. Other references, and vocabulary in particular, in the episode represent terms or concepts now defined as abhorrent in theory, if not yet in practice. In fact, many of the references in this episode are shocking or hard to hear today, but in context, the show was groundbreakingly progressive at the time. Placing the show and episode within the context of the 70s American culture allows for a critical and contextual understanding and analysis of the show and its content and language. For our purposes, the riddle works to highlight the contextualization of language. We also see similar conversations and questions in current American culture. Different groups use different terms differently, and meaning can be obscured. The language you use can identify you as a member of a group that identifies with specific theories and practices translated through the use of specific terms. And being an outsider can make it difficult to understand the intentions of the language even in context. Exploring discourse communities and their literacy practices offered us a peek into how different individuals come together and establish and execute communication practices and patterns that are specific to the group. We also learned that the scholarly peer-reviewed articles that serve as the foundation of credible communication within academic discourse community are written by and for a disciplinary discourse community of subject matter experts who use specific literacy practices to communicate, which makes outsiders feel othered because they cannot understand or participate in the communication. However, we also learn to navigate these texts and extract the important information without feeling intimidated or overwhelmed. Like writing, when we talk about language, we are really talking about far more than language. We recognize that language is a coded term that represents individual linguistic identities and collective cultural connotations. And although the broad concepts of codes and moves can be traced across spaces and on faces, our focus is on language and writing in particular. We will take a closer look at moves and codes in 24.1. But to start, let's look at language and the meaning and messages coded in everyday language and literacy. Language. When two languages come in contact, it is historically the case that a minority and a majority language form in the area. In America, indigenous languages were the majority language before English settlers began expeditions, the first in 1584 in North Carolina, that colonized the land. For example, in Tampa, Florida, the majority language was Tocobaga, which belongs to the Seminole tribe. The linguistic diversity in America led to the borrowing of words from indigenous languages, some of which you may still use today, like chocolate, tomato, tobacco, and iguana. As we know now, English is used everywhere, but indigenous languages are spoken less often and rarely taught in traditional education settings due to broad colonization. But colonialism has a long history and did not start and end in America. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I sent trading merchants from London to India. These merchants later became the British East India Company, which monopolized India until 1858, when the company was abolished during the Indian Rebellion just a year prior. Their rule was so long that three universities established in Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras in 1857, which has since led to British Standard English being spoken and used within India's secondary and higher education, government administration, and legal system, among other contexts. English has more speakers worldwide than any other language, but only if we count non-native speakers. When we look at native speakers, less than 5% of the population of the world speaks English as a first language, approximately 370 million people. English ranks third among languages spoken by native speakers. Nearly 100 million more people speak Spanish as a first language, and well over 900 million more speak Mandarin as a native language, which means that English is the minority language in most cases than it is the majority language, and that most people speaking English are probably code switching or meshing for their audience. If you are in modern America, you don't have to think before you speak English because you can assume that you will be speaking to people who speak English and assume you speak English. The same assumptions can be made if you visit parts of India that were once colonized by the British. Assuming that English is dominant and spoken elsewhere has historically led to what linguists call language death and the phenomenon of code switching, which perpetuates certain languages being spoken in particular contexts rather than championing multiple languages being spoken in the same context, like code meshing. If you travel to most areas in the world, however, English may be a secondary language, but it will not be the majority language. If you visit Iceland, for instance, you will be understood in English because it's taught in schools as a second language or third or fourth language. Many areas in the world teach and use more than one language, which facilitates meshing of languages more than switching. If you travel to Quebec, the major language is Canadian French, and even within areas that share a language, we find variations. A dialect is a localization of a language within a specific region or group. We can point at word usage like soda or pop or Coke to demonstrate how English across the United States can use different terms to say the same thing in different areas. These variations in terms and tones represent variations in cultural in meaning as well as place. A Floridian waiter can figure out what a Midwesterner means when she says pop, but the meaning being translated is not only that she is thirsty for a bubbly drink, but also that she is not from Florida. If the waiter understands the use of the coded term and is fluid in Midwestern dialect, he can make the move of using pop and other terms associated with the regional dialect in order to communicate with his audience. Moves and codes like this appear subtle and simple, but they are the surface of a deeper meaning, and we can create and find through uses of language. Your language and our language. While the concepts of code meshing and code switching can be applied strictly to different languages, we can also recognize the switches that apply to what we say and how we speak when we communicate across audiences and genres and spaces. Context cues and clues allow our shifts to be communicated in various situations and spaces. We all shift in some ways and remain stable in others. And our shifting spaces and stable spaces move into and through our writing. You don't have to speak or write multiple languages to switch in ways that can be detected in your writing. When we look at where we make moves and switches and switch codes, we are looking at and for the ways in which we manipulate writing in order to construct and conduct meaning. The moves we make and respond to in digital spaces might seem frivolous at times, but they can create social networks that can create concrete social change. Finding the Self in Selfie discusses the context of connections as created through comments and explores all the meaning that can be conveyed through language. To understand the meaning, however, requires understanding the context of the comments. The ability to move and shift through the nuanced language practices and expectations of various groups can impact not only the clarity of our communications, but our ability to make and maintain connections. Listen to Finding the Self in Selfie to understand the content, but also think about how it applies to Project 3 and ENC 1101 and beyond. Specifically consider how it applies to